Good day, everybody. This is Yin Yang in California with Morsels of a Thought number 1459. We're in California. I am at, I guess, 5:12 now, a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Uh, you'll hear me say a lot of things about staying on standard time or staying on daylight saving time. Pick one, pick the other. Just stay on one. Oh my gosh. You know what I think is when we fall back and then there's time to spring forward, we should just stay back. We'll be an hour late to everything, but that's because everybody else would be hectically running to get an hour early to everything, including sunrise, except for they can't do that. So here we are. I'm in the introduction. We're on page 34. We paused at Crates is an anecdote whose tenor is now uncertain. Okay, they're not too sure about this guy, whether he's a cynic or not. Cynic or stoic. Anyway, here we're Marcus's relationship to Epicureanism. Oh golly, I've got to turn this thing down. I have a tendency to forget about my phones. I have more than one phone, as you can see. I'm using a phone. Marcus's relationship to we're in Meditations translated by Gregory Hayes. Marcus Aurelius wrote these meditations, and he wrote 12 books. We have read all 12 books in this book. I just checked this morning, and we have indeed gone through all of the books, and I want to read some of the 54 pages of introduction, of which we have already done 34. So I think, the more we read of it, the more we remember what we read. Actually, good morning, John Clark. How are you doing today? How's your wife, Barbara? How's she doing? I hope she's okay. I don't see why she wouldn't be, but anyway, I thought I'd say hi. Marcus's relationship to Epicureanism, Stoicism's great rival among Hellenistic philosophical systems, is much more vexed. The followers of Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BC, believed in a universe radically unlike that point posited by Zeno and Chrysippus. The Stoic world is ordered to the nth degree. The Epicurean universe is random, the product of the haphazard conjunctions of billions of atoms. To speak of providence in such a world is transparently absurd. And while Epicurus acknowledged the existence of gods, he denied that they took any interest in human life. As for humans, our role is simply to live as best we can, making the most of what pleasures are available to us and insulating ourselves as far as possible from pain and anxiety. Girls, sorry. In particular, we are to feel no anxiety about death, which consists simply in the dissolution of our component atoms. This process is not only inevitable, but harmless for the simple reason that after death there is no us to suffer harm. That was the Epicurean way of looking at the logos. We don't have logos in the Epicurean fashion. Although the sect, Epicurean sect, numbered not a few prominent Romans among its adherents, it never attained the success of Stoicism and was regarded with genial contempt by most outsiders. That's exactly what I just showed. The Quietism, endorsed by the Epicureans, was obviously difficult to reconcile with an active public life, an important Roman value, and the Epicurean equation of the good with pleasure was bound to raise eyebrows among conservative Romans. Good morning, Liz Rose Cantara. Eat, drink, and be merry was popularly supposed to be the Epicureans' motto. Really? Wow. though Epicurus himself had been quite explicit in identifying pleasure with intellectual contemplation rather than the vulgar enjoyment of food and sex. Though a minority view, Epicureanism was nonetheless the only potential rival to Stoicism in offering a systematic cosmology, as Marcus acknowledges on a number of occasions by the stark dichotomy providence or atoms. That's book 4, number 3, book 10, number 6, book 11, number 18, book 12, number 14. Marcus normally seems to view Epicureanism with disapproval, as we would expect. In Meditations, Book 6, number 10, he contrasts the Epicurean universe founded on mixture, interaction, dispersal with the components of the Stoic system, unity, order, design, clearly to the advantage of the latter. Should we not be ashamed to fear death, he asks in another entry, when even the Epicureans disdain it in Book 12, number 34, but other entries suggest a less dismissive attitude. Marcus quotes with apparent approval Epicurus's account of his own exemplary conduct during an illness, Book 9, number 41, and twice seeks comfort in the philosopher's remarks on the endurance of pain, Book 7, number 33, and number 64. Like other late Stoics, Seneca is a notable example, he was willing to accept truth wherever he found it. Thus far, we have been concerned with the content of the Meditations, the ethical doctrine of late Stoicism, incorporating a certain amount of Platonic and Heraclitean material, and overlaid with occasional reference to other schools and thinkers. But what of the Meditations itself? How and why was it written? Who is its audience? What kind of book is it? For the answers to these questions, we must turn from the book's content to its form and origins. The Meditations, genre, structure, and style. So we have read through the books in random order, but through each book. And this one is talking about how it was set up together. So here we are. The Meditations, genre, structure, and style. The translator Gregory Hayes says, I suspect that Marcus would have been surprised and perhaps rather dismayed to find himself enshrined in the modern library of the world's best books. He would have been surprised, to begin with, by the title of the work ascribed to him. The long-established English title Meditations is not only not original, but positively misleading, lending a spurious air of resonance and authority quite alien to the haphazard set of notes that constitute the book. In the lost Greek manuscript used for the first printed edition, itself many generations removed from Marcus's original, the work was entitled To Himself, Eis Beoton. Oh goodness. Heoton. Anyway, this is no more likely than Meditations to be the original title, though it is at least a somewhat more accurate description of the work. Note 6. I'm going to look at the note because I haven't looked at any of the notes before, but there are notes in here in the background to say what the footnotes tell you. No, they don't, actually. Every time I look for the footnote, it's not there. Sorry. In fact, it seems unlikely that Marcus himself gave the work any title at all, for the simple reason that he did not think of it as an organic whole in the first place. Not only was it not written for publication, but Marcus clearly had no expectation that anyone but himself would ever read it. The entries include a number of cryptic references to persons or events that an ancient reader would have found as unintelligible as we do, while a contemporary might have recognized some of the figures mentioned in Meditations, Book 8, number 25, or Book 12, number 27, for example. No ancient reader could have known what was in the letter that Rusticus wrote from Sinuessa, Book 1, number 7. What Antoninus said to the customs agent at Tusculum, Book 1, number 16, or what happened to Marcus at Caieta, Cieta, book 1, number 17. Elsewhere, Marcus reflects directly on his role as emperor in terms that would be quite irrelevant to anyone else. We find him worrying about the dangers of becoming imperialized, book 6, number 30, reminding himself to speak simply in the Senate, book 8, number 30, and reflecting on the unique position he occupies, book 11, number 7. From these entries and others, it seems clear that the you of the text is not a generic you, but the emperor himself. When you look at yourself, see any of the emperors, book 10, number 31. That's what he says to himself. How are we to categorize the meditations? It is not a diary, at least in the conventional sense. The entries contain little or nothing related to Marcus's day-to-day life, few names, no dates, and with two exceptions, no places. It also lacks the sense of audience, the reader over one's shoulder that tends to characterize even the most secretive diarist. Some scholars have seen it as the basis for an unwritten larger treatise like Pascal's Pensées or the notebooks of Joseph Joubert. Yet the notes are too repetitive. They are, aren't they? And in a philosophical sense, too elementary for that. The entries perhaps bear a somewhat closer resemblance to the working notes of a practicing philosopher. Wittgenstein's Zettel, say, or the Cahiers of Simone Weil. Yet here too there is a significant difference. The Meditations is not tentative and exploratory like the notes of Wittgenstein or Weil, and it contains little or nothing that is original. It suggests not a mind recording new perceptions or experimenting with new arguments, but one obsessively repeating and reframing ideas long familiar but imperfectly absorbed. Perhaps the best description of the entries is that suggested by the French scholar Pierre Hadot. They are spiritual exercises composed to provide a momentary stay against the stress and confusion of everyday life, a self-help book in the most literal sense. A revealing comment in this context is Meditations, book 5, number 9, where Marcus reminds himself not to think of philosophy as your instructor, but as the sponge and egg white that relieve ophthalmia as a soothing ointment. On this reading, the individual entries were composed not as a record of Marcus's thoughts or to enlighten others, but for his own use, as a means of practicing and reinforcing his own philosophical convictions. Such an interpretation accounts for several aspects of the entries that would otherwise be puzzling. It explains the predominance of the imperative in the text, imperative meaning you must do this, that imperative mood. Its purpose is not to describe or reflect, let alone to meditate, but to urge, direct, and exhort. And it explains also the repetitiveness that strikes any reader of the work almost immediately, the continual circling back to the same few problems. The entries do not present new answers or novel solutions to these problems, but only familiar answers reframed. It was precisely, good morning, Karen Sue. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That's nice. Let me finish this paragraph and I'll say something. But only familiar answers reframed. It was precisely this process of reframing and re-expressing that Marcus found helpful. I forgot to remove the thing from last night. It says 2-drink minimum. It's in fluorescent green. I saw a comedian named Steve Hofstetter, and he was really good. Anyway, and my point was that I wore makeup. I wore like 3 feet of makeup thickness wise. So anyway, good morning, Gina Potov. The recognition that the entries are as much process as product also accounts for the shapelessness and apparent disorder of the work. We do not know by whom or on what basis the individual books of the meditations were arranged. The order may be chronological or partly chronological or wholly arbitrary. The arrangement of the individual entries may or may not be Marcus's own, though its very randomness suggests that it goes back to the author. A later editor would have been tempted to group together thematically similar entries and perhaps tie up some of the more obvious loose ends. Nor can we always be sure when individual entries begin and end. In some cases, this is a question Marcus himself might not have been able to answer. A special position is occupied by Book 1, which is distinguished from the rest of the book by its autobiographical nature and by the greater impression of conscious design and ordering apparent in it. It consists of 17 entries in which Marcus reflects on what he learned from various individuals in his life, either directly or from their example, hence the title I have given the section here, Debts and Lessons, which has no warrant in the transmitted text. The entries roughly mirror the chronology of Marcus's early life, from his older relatives to his teacher to his adopted father Antoninus, and ultimately to the gods. This logical schema, as well as the increasing length of the entries, suggests deliberate arrangement, presumably by Marcus himself. If so, then this book at least was conceived as an organic whole, WHOLE. It may be amongst the latest portions of the text, if scholars are correct in thinking, as most do, that the short sketch of Antoninus Pius in Meditations, Book 6, number 30, was the starting point for the longer memoir in Book 1, number 16. Attempts to find organic unity in the remaining books or development from book to book are doomed to failure. Wherever one opens the Meditations, with the exception of Book 1, we find the same voice, the same themes. Marcus's thought does not change or develop noticeably from one book to another, nor can any structure or unity be discerned within individual books. It seems most likely that the division between books is a purely physical one. The transmitted books, in other words, represent the individual papyrus rolls of Marcus's original or perhaps of a later copy. When one had been filled, another was begun. If the books as a whole are homogeneous, the individual entries show considerable formal variety. Some are developed short essays that make a single philosophical point. Many of the entries in books 2 and 3 are of this type. Others are straightforward imperatives, take the shortest route, or aphorisms, no one can keep you from living in harmony with yourself. Sometimes Marcus will list a number of basic principles in catalog format. Remember that, and that, and that. Elsewhere, he puts forward an analogy, sometimes with the point of comparison left to be inferred. Thus, human lives are like many lumps of incense on the same altar, Book 4, number 15, or like a rock thrown in the air, Book 9, number 17. In other cases, the analogy will be made explicit. Have you ever seen a severed hand or foot? That's what we do to ourselves when we rebel against what happens to us. Right? Book 8, number 34. Others present a kind of formal meditative exercise, as when Marcus instructs himself to imagine the age of Vespasian, Book 4, number 32, or Augustus's court, Book 8, number 31, and then to compare the imagined scene with that of his own time. Portions of 2 books, 7 and 11, consist simply of quotations. Some entries appear to be rough drafts for others. Several of the raw quotations from the tragedies in Book 7 are incorporated in the much more polished Meditations, Book 11, number 6. The significance of some entries remains completely obscure. Few critics have known what to make of notes like character, dark, womanish, obstinate, Book 4, number 28, or they don't realize how much is included in stealing, sewing, buying, SOWING, Book 3, number 15. The entries also differ considerably in the degree of artistry they display. Some entries are little more than Marcus's notes or reminders to himself, the philosophical equivalent of phone doctor re-appointment Tuesday, but others are highly literary. Marcus wrote as a man trained in the rhetorical techniques of the second century. His thoughts, he lived in the second century AD. His thoughts naturally took on the impress of his training and intellectual milieu, even when he was writing for himself alone. This is a translator speaking. The shorter entry, he deserves to speak this way. If he can translate Latin into this, oh, goodness gracious, right? The shorter entries often display an interest in wordplay and a striving for epigrammatic brevity that recalls both the ingenuity of the rhetorical schools and the paradoxical compression of Heraclitus. Does the sun try to do the rain's work? Or Asclepius Demeter's? Book 6, number 43. Evil, the same old thing. Book 7, number 1. Not a dancer, but a wrestler. Book 7, number 61. To accept it without arrogance, to let it go with indifference. Book 8, number 33, talking about life and death. The philosophical tradition may have been influential on another element that we find occasionally, the intermittent snatches of dialogue or quasi-dialogue. As a developed form, the philosophical dialogue goes back to Plato, who was imitated by later philosophers, notably Aristotle in his Lost Works and Cicero. The Meditations certainly does not contain the kind of elaborate scene setting that we expect in a true dialogue, but we do find in a number of entries a kind of internal debate in which the questions or objections of an imaginary interlocutor is a person, go-between speaker, are answered by a second, calmer voice which corrects or rebukes its errors. The first voice seems to represent Marcus's weaker human side. The second is the voice of philosophy. So we'll pause here. This is very interesting to me. I know that it sounds like seventh grade Latin or something, and it is indeed difficult to understand unless you're really, really concentrating on reading it. But I think that when we see somebody way back when saying those things, like those expressions that we saw, we know that our humanity is something we have inherited, and that's part of us for generations and generations to come. So we need to learn about ourselves, and we also need to understand the logos, which is the concept of his nearest concept of God in Christianity, for example, which is parallel at the same time. So people that were living at the same time as Christ's disciples and all that, followers, were living at the same time. So that's what we have for today. I hope you guys have a great day. I hope that we inspired, imparted, and entertained and educated. And I should trademark that or something, okay? Old Kinderhook.